So good
How
to
are
see
you?
you. You are fantastic.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you
Peter.
very much
Yeah.
for sharing that too. Your son is Scott.
Yeah. Well, I could, So Peter is really nervous. I know because his daughter told me, Rennie. You don't look nervous. So we'll start with Patrick here and let you settle in.
Well, first of all, I think all of us want to tell you how much our hearts go out to you and how powerful it is that you're able to say that and talk about your own pain and suffering and do it such that we can eliminate this kind of pain and suffering for other families. And so I want to salute you. I want to salute Peter and Mimi for doing the same thing. We would not be here today if I hadn't gotten that phone call from Peter saying, we want to run towards the problem, not away from it. After having suffered a similar loss of PJ, just as you lost your son. And I think that all of us owe an enormous debt of gratitude to those that are breaking the silence. And that's so much a part of what we're doing here today, is to break the silence that surrounds these issues, because these are medical issues like you talked about. They're not moral judgments that we make on people who suffer from them. And if anyone takes any other message out of why we're here today, that should be the message. And I want all of us to stand and give a rousing applause to Bill and Peter and Mimi for allowing us all to be here today. Now I've got Peter really nervous.
Yeah.
Now, if he wasn't before, I've really got him nervous.
You grab a hold. You.
Well, actually, former congressman from Rhode Island, my mother's favorite state and birth state, I want to echo that. Bill, I've known you publicly in the city of Chicago for so many years, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your story of Scott's loss. It's something that we all need to do. We need to break the silence. It's not about the closet. We need to come out of the closet with this illness and this issue so that those of us that suffer, so that our children, so that our mothers, our brothers, our sons, our daughters, all can get the care that they need at the earliest stages. And Bill, your breaking the silence today is what we were looking for about a year ago when we started this. So thank you very much. And please, I'm going to echo you, Congressman Kennedy. Please, a round of applause for Bill Kurtis alone, because he is a voice in Chicago.
Well, thank you. But I got to tell you, I'm not as brave as you would like to think, because this is only the second time that I think I have stood up and addressed it publicly. It's just, it's your life's failure. You feel like that.
That's right.
And you have to change that attitude.
That's right.
So I really, anyway, instead
No,
of patting each other on the back, why, let's actually move on. So maybe this is the start. And anyway.
So Bill, this is the common struggle. It's coping with the concept that we have grown up with this notion that people suffering from these illnesses are somehow less than, because the illness that they suffer from is a brain illness as opposed to an illness of any other organ of the body. It is fickle. It's fickle. And in years to come, we'll look back on this period and wonder, how was it that we could let people suffering from these illnesses, live in squalor on the streets because we don't treat these illnesses? How is it that we can say that our prisons and jails are the single largest institution that we put people suffering from these illnesses? How is it that we can let this country have a suicide rate that's twice the homicide rate and have overdoses surpass car accidents and not talk about it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's stunning how silent as a nation we are, Bill, when these issues that affected your family personally, and Peter and my family, all of our families personally, how we have no organized political agenda to actually address a public health epidemic out there.
Yeah, we don't want to admit it. I'll give you a good example. I was on the air, and it must have been a couple of years ago, when the Arizona shooter shot the congressman and killed, I think, about 7. And as the facts came out, I could read it.
Yeah.
And it was my son. It was everybody who really experiences and lives with schizophrenia, or someone who has it. And so I said, I've had experience. My son has schizophrenia, and I can see clearly the earmarks of someone who is mentally ill.
Yes.
The camera goes off, and the people in the studio are frozen.
Yeah.
And the newsroom, they came in and they say, we had no idea.
Right.
How have you lived with all this? And I said, well, how do you not know about it? And I just thought I was talking about cancer. Yeah. Or a severe disease.
That's right.
But no, it was mental illness with that dread word, schizophrenia.
Right.
And it is an untouchable.
Yes.
Well, that's what we're going to do.
It's really the last medical taboo.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the last medical taboo. And we need to do, what the AIDS crisis invoked people to do with the ACT UP, where people were dying of record rates. And as all of you saw, the study recently released by the Nobel laureate that mortality rates in this country are going up for suicide and overdose. No surprise, when all other health indices are going in the opposite direction, they're going down. And during the AIDS crisis, it was silence equals death. That was the sign. Silence equals death. And frankly, how apropos for these illnesses that we are condemned to silence as opposed to speaking out on them.
Well, and veterans, they come back from being heroes, supported by a nation, feeling and told that they are on a national mission, and suddenly there's no military around, they can't get a job, and they are mentally depressed to the point that they slide into a death spiral and kill themselves. Is it one death?
It's 22 veterans a day successfully complete suicide. The word complete is really key here because there's so many more that attempt it and contemplate it, frankly, on a daily basis. What we've done with our veterans is a shame. If we can't address their invisible wounds, we call them invisible wounds of war, but they're not invisible. You could actually see and compare, brain scans before they served our country and after the field of battle, and the trauma of living in these very near-death situations where they're always threatened. Even if no one knows where the front lines are in the war on terror. It could be a bomb right in wherever the camp is that you live in. So these veterans are suffering, and most veterans are going to be covered by their employer-sponsored health care bill. It's not going to necessarily be the VA, because so long as they come home and they don't have any outward wounds, then they go about their lives and no one appreciates that their brains were injured. And Bill, that's why we translate this to a political fight to make sure self-insured plans that cover people through their place of employment have sufficient and adequate networks to treat the signature wounds of war, of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And frankly, Bill, today, most health networks do not adequately cover and treat these signature wounds of war, which is why us discussing this on Veterans Day it is so apropos.
I hope this has changed, but 15 years ago, I went to Northwestern in the psychiatric ward where my son was taken, and I said, I need long-term care, as the psychiatrist had told me. And he said, well, you'll have to take him to Kansas in Menningers, best in the country, because the insurance runs out in 30 days. The insurance has learned that there's no cure. There's treatment, and they don't want to foot the bill because it could break.
Well, that has changed now, Bill.
Good.
Because of
That's
Congressman
my
Kennedy,
question.
because of the late Senator Ted Kennedy, we now have parity in all of the land. And that's what I think we need to echo today. And politically speaking, so Patrick, as you know, I come from Chicago, from the Old Town area of Chicago. Politics is very important. So after I lost PJ, then I saw you on TV. I knew that politically speaking, that could make a difference to all of us, to break the silence. And I think that, you know, as you said, Bill, our veterans come home from being heroes and being protectors of all of us and having that feeling in their heart and their minds of saving our country, then come home and they're pushed into the closet. And I've got to tell you that when we got together, and I got some great leaders in the city of Chicago together, Justice Ann Burke comes to mind, Dr. Lori Jones comes to mind, State Representative Sarah Feigenholtz comes to mind. We got together, and Mark Ishug from Threshold said, you know, this is truly like AIDS. It's in the closet. We need to bring it out of the closet. And so, Patrick, your voice through the whole country has brought us all to understand that it truly is a common struggle. And your book has just brought it to the level that I think is going to make a difference in my generation. I was always expecting that it was going to be my daughters, Renee, Megan, and Caitlin's generation. But no, I think that we can break that silence and break that glass wall now because of you and because of you, Bill.
Well, not because of me, but because of Patrick. But let's talk about parity for a moment, because I come in and I don't know the latest. So what do you mean, won by parity? Is the battle over?
Good point. So it's really relevant to know when you pass a law, it's not always the law of the land in implementation and in execution. So in 2008, George W. Bush signed the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which says whether you're inpatient in-network or outpatient in-network or inpatient out-of-network or outpatient out-of-network, or you need pharmacy ER benefits, you must have the same levels of treatment at the primary care level, secondary care level, and tertiary care level that you would receive, Bill, if you had diabetes, if you had cancer, if you had cardiovascular disease. So if you can check the box that an insurance company would pay for coverage for any of those other illnesses in those boxes, then the parity law says you must treat a brain illness also at the same level in what we call an analogous way. So the real issue now, Bill, is we need to hold insurance companies accountable to the parity law, because the parity law's premise is that it is comparable. The only way you can enforce that comparison is to know how the person seeking treatment for a mental illness and addiction is treated and compare it to how the person with diabetes and cardiovascular disease and cancer is treated. So basically what that means is you got to get into the weeds, Bill, to really measure whether there is more onerous treatment limitations put on the person seeking care for mental illness and addiction that would not be put on the cancer patient or the diabetic or the cardiovascular disease patient. And the only way, Bill, for us to know this is if insurance companies demonstrate that when they apply their medical utilization review criteria, that they do so in an equal way with someone seeking mental health treatment and addiction treatment as they would medical and surgical care. So that all sounds complicated. That's the law. And what we need as a community is to enforce the law, which means all of you here today have a stake in making sure here in Illinois, as you go through this revolution of managed care taking over your health care, that you hold those new managed care companies accountable so that your brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, if they should ever need treatment for mental illness and addiction, are no longer treated differently for these illnesses as they would be treated for any other illness.
In my mind, that's the most important message we can get today. And if you have not had a relative or friend, or God forbid, a daughter or son, who suffers from schizophrenia, you will need this. So go in. We ought to type it out so you can go in with this law and
So we need to
fight the battle individually.
Yeah, so most people are reticent to seek treatment, right? Because of the shame of having to be in a, quote, mental health system as opposed to a healthcare system. That's another issue here, is that we've carved out and separated mental health from overall health. But two, if they do, they're often facing the treatment limitations that you spoke about in terms of, arbitrary limits on care. What we want to do at the Kennedy Forum, Illinois, is bring your stories, because whether you're successful or not in your appeals, if you're denied care, what we do is if we can collect all the stories, it will give us as political leaders the ammunition we need to go to your insurance commissioner or go to your attorney general or go to your governor and say, Mr. Attorney General, your people here in Illinois are being discriminated against. You have an obligation to enforce the law. That means we no longer have to feel victims and then have no recourse. We actually are empowered, Bill, now with the tools to really fight for our loved ones.
So you know all those little housekeeping things that you didn't pay any attention to that I was reading earlier? There's a reason. I mentioned StoryCorps.
Yes.
Go record your stories. You are accumulating volumes, hopefully,
Yes.
and you take those to the lawmakers and really get some things done.
It's kind of like an early surveillance. If you pop up a lot of denials for eating disorders, for bipolar depression, for addiction and the lack of access, you can start to make a better political case for coverage is what you can do.
And for Mimi and I, that's what this is all about. We have one story. Bill, you have another story. If we combine all of our stories together, we will make a difference. And we can make a difference largely because of this man sitting in the middle, because Patrick passed the parity law of 2008. Now the insurance companies will follow our stories. They have to. It's the law. But we don't stand alone, and it's not just Peter's story or Scott's story or Patrick's story, but it's all of our stories out there. And I plead with you, don't be silent any longer. Break the silence. Talk. It's a common struggle.
And the reason we have to start talking is that this is an amorphous, sort of dark abyss, and there are really few answers. I was sitting with a doctor talking about the early diagnosis of Scott at Menninger's, and I said, is Scott going to be a violent case of schizophrenia, to pick up a gun? And he said, no, he's not that kind of schizophrenic. Don't say that. But I'm wondering, I've always wondered if he could turn into that. So there are different degrees that we have to learn, and it's only through research and the thought that we have kept it hidden in the snake pits of Carl Menninger, railed against there in Topeka for decades, that we have kept it there, out of sight, out of sight.
Yes.
So you know what you have to do now. And I think I recognize you for coming.
So, you know, Bill, the future is bright. You know, we've had very dark periods. People are now in jail. 50 years ago, my uncle really tried to get people out of asylums. Well, the jails are the new asylums. We need to treat people, not jail people. And the answer, Bill, is early intervention. We have evidence-based models now where on the first incidence of psychosis, if we do early intervention and wraparound services as opposed to wait for someone to have a second, third, fourth pathology of the illness, then we can actually interrupt the trajectory of the illness, and the person does not have to live with having to take high levels of medication, you know, as they currently have to, because by the time we reach them, Bill, it's often after their illness is pathologized. We do not, as a nation, have to do that anymore if we make the political decision that we're not going to tolerate that anymore. So that's where all of you come into play here. We know what to do to tackle this issue. What we now need is the political will to make sure that what we know works actually gets implemented, both in our country and in our private insurance system.
I'll applaud that. You're absolutely
Okay.
right, Patrick.